right, let's talk about Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, the fifth and presumably last entry in this franchise. You know, like many of you, I grew up on Indiana Jones. Raiders of the Lost Ark is not only one of those seminal childhood films, but it's simply one of Steven Spielberg's best movies. To this date, it's one of those great movies that gets you into watching movies and loving cinema and what it can offer. And say what you will about The Temple of Doom and The Last Crusade, but I think those are fun sequels. The Last Crusade especially, I think, is actually very good. I really like that film quite a bit. Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, I know it's had a little bit of a reformation over the last few years. I still don't love the movie, but I can appreciate Spielberg's craft, what he brings to it as a director. But on the whole, I still don't think that film is all that great. And here we are with The Dial of Destiny, the first of these movies that's obviously not directed by Spielberg. Instead, we have James Mangold behind the camera. And I gotta say, I did really like this film. It has its bombastic action, of course. It has its weird narrative turns, as all of these films do. But at its heart, it's this poignant reflection on Indiana Jones. It's this beautiful send off to the character that I found really moving. It's comparable to something like Martin Scorsese and The Irishman, or Quentin Tarantino in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and how those films were these introspective reflections on their careers. This film is doing the same thing, but for Indiana Jones. It's about him looking at history and wrestling with how it's defined him, why it's such a big part of the nucleus of who he is. And Harrison Ford, he's of course great as Indiana Jones, but he's especially excellent in this film, and how he taps into that specifically in his performance. I would also say the same thing about the cameos in this film and the little things that Mangold throws in here that could seem as audience pandering, or it's there for nostalgic sake. I don't think that is the case. Not entirely anyway. Perhaps it is slightly. Mostly though, the film uses Indiana Jones lore, cameos, characters, subtle references to amplify this idea of Indiana Jones and examining history and what it means to him and how that affects his choices throughout a lot of this film. And it's really beautiful. And it's ultimately why I really liked it, especially when you consider Indiana Jones and his relationship with the Helena Shaw character here, played by Phoebe Waller-Bridge. She is the daughter of Basil Shaw, who is played by Toby Jones. And he is a trusted friend of Indiana Jones. We see him prominently in that opening action sequence, which is this interesting pseudo sequel to The Last Crusade, which is quite fascinating. But most of the film takes place in modern day, or I should say 20 years-ish later, like the late 60s, where Harrison Ford can play his age as Indiana Jones. And so we see this relationship dynamic between Indiana and Helena throughout the film. But I think what's interesting is that Helena isn't this trustworthy character for Indiana Jones. In fact, she's a little prickly. She's a little rough around the edges. And I think Waller-Bridge does a really good job of tapping into that in her performance. And it certainly makes for some fascinating character banter throughout the film. I also think it's compelling how Helena changes and evolves over the course of the film when she continuously sees Indiana Jones' sincerity for history and how he continues to show reverence for it because of how it has defined him. And at his age, it's something that is, I don't want to say an existential crisis of sorts, but it's certainly something that he is reflecting on more and more. And that does affect Helena and how she ultimately reacts to Indiana Jones. There's a great scene near the end of this film. Obviously, not going to get into spoilers, but Indiana Jones, I'll say as vaguely as I can, wants to choose history. And there's a tangibility to this choice. But the moment comes to a head, and it's really great because there's a sincerity to it, there's a poignancy to it, but also there's some great comedy, and the chemistry between Ford and Waller Bridge is great. That dynamic between those two characters crystallizes wonderfully. It leads to this great ending scene, which, again, not going to get into for spoilers, but how the film shows reverence to Indiana Jones, the character, and the franchise is so heartwarming and moving. It's really great. And I do love how the film, again, tackles this idea of history and how it's defined Indiana Jones, going back to that Irishman, Once Upon a Time on Hollywood thing, where this film wants to reckon with Indiana Jones and his legacy and what it means for this character. It's really great. And ultimately, that is why I really like this movie quite a bit. Now we get to James Mangold's direction, and I do think that's where this film will be the most polarizing, because James Mangold, who I do really like, I think he's more than a capable director. I've liked most of his movies, but this is him straying from his usual style, and here he's clearly trying to be an imitation of Spielberg with the camera tricks, the way the camera moves, the editing, the visual eye that he is going for here. It is so transparently an imitation. It is him mimicking Spielberg, and he just doesn't have the same prowess as Spielberg. He's not Steven Spielberg, and so those, you can see the mechanics of that within his direction, within the cinematography, within the editing of the film. It also has that modern Disney sheen to it that I don't really love either. So visually speaking, I do think this film leaves a lot to be desired. I didn't quite love it. It's tepid and muddled, and it's distracting at times. The imitation effect of Mangold's direction, I do think, is often distracting. But if I step outside of that, I still think there are good things here. The action is well staged. It's well composed. You know, that opening action sequence I mentioned earlier on the train, I think is thrilling. Still a lot of fun to be had there. With all of these Indiana Jones, things are going to get bizarre and baffling narratively, and this film is no different. But when that comes, I think the action and the intensity of it that comes about in Mangold's direction, that is still effective. I will give him credit for that. He's certainly well known for that in his other movies, and that does come through here, despite how lukewarm I am on this film from a visual perspective. Then there's John Williams. God bless the man. This is his last score, I believe, and I think he goes out on a high note. I don't know if this has any sort of Oscars potential, but it is very good. And I think what's so fascinating about John Williams here and his score, I took my 7-year-old son to see this movie with me, which in itself is poetic and perhaps a little bit poignant because I grew up with these films, as I'm sure a lot of you did as well. And all these years later, 30 some odd years later, I got to take my 7-year-old son who does like these films. I did show him the previous Indiana Jones films, but to experience another one in theaters was special, especially because of what John Williams brings here, because there were more than a few moments when that main theme hits and he would look up at me and he would glance and get excited, and I could see his joy come through within the score and how it is affecting what he's seeing on screen. It was gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. So I love John Williams, and I do think he has a great score here that is more than effective for what this film calls for. But ultimately, I do like this movie. It has its issues, mostly visually for me, but I like its heart. I love its sincerity. And as a send off to this character that we all love and adore, I do think that it sticks to landing. I think it sticks to landing quite well. And as a result, you know what? I might actually put this as my third favorite Indiana Jones film. Temple of Doom, again, I admire Spielberg's craft. I don't know if that film has aged as well, where Last Crusade, I think, has aged impeccably, coupled with Spielberg's craft. That's easily my second favorite behind Raiders. I would put this third, and with Temple of Doom and Kingdom of the Crystal Skull following. So, take that for what it's worth, but I did like the film on the whole. We'll have a podcast review of this coming soon as well, where we'll get more in depth with the movie, perhaps get into a little bit of spoilers. We'll have a written review for this up at InSessionFilm.com as well. And with that, go see it. I hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you next time.